Okay, we are on peripheral nervous system. All right, so when it comes to the peripheral nervous system, remember we looked at the general plan, at the beginning of the nervous system. We had the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Then you had the peripheral nervous system. Sensory in was indicated in blue on the left and the three different sources. And then over to the right, we have the motor division. We have a single motor neuron supplying the somatic division, and then a two neuron chain when it comes to the parasympathetic division. Okay, so sensory receptors. Receptors are specialized nerve structures that respond to changes in the environment. They generate greater potentials that trigger action potentials in sensory nerves. One sensory neuron only carries information for one sensation. And that's pretty much the plan all over the body. We're going to look at how we classify different receptors, and generally it's one sensation. Okay, and here we go. All right, so we can classify receptors by the stimulus they detect or the change in the environment that they detect. We have mechanoreceptors that respond to touch, pressure, stretch, some kind of physical deformation. I always kind of hold my hands up and like you're I don't know, you're just kind of pushing and pulling, like a shopping cart in front of you. Something mechanically happening. And we see these types of receptors where we have some kind of physical deformation. We know we had it in the skin because we had Meissner's and Pacinian corpuscles, right? You actually had to compress through the epidermis into the dermis to reach these receptors. So something is compressing and physically happening. When fluid-filled chambers that have little hairs that extend into the fluid, when the fluid moves, it bends the hairs. Or even when you have the little hairs on your arm or on the back of your neck, we said that when it came to some of the functions of hair, when we looked at the integumentary system, we said it acts as a touch receptor of some kind. Well, that's a mechanoreceptor because it responds to something pushing on that hair one way or the other, and that stimulates a signal, on the sensory neuron. Okay, so mechanoreceptors, something physically happening there. All right. Thermoreceptors respond to temperature changes. Photoreceptors respond to light energy. Chemoreceptors respond to chemicals in solution. They generally need to be in aqueous solution, which means they need to be somehow dissolved in water, in a watery environment, and then the receptors can kind of capture their presence. Things like taste, smell, oxygen, carbon dioxide levels, hydrogen ion levels, those are all chemoreceptors. Nociceptors respond to pain, and baroreceptors respond to pressure and stretch found in blood vessels like the carotid arteries and the aortic arch, those two areas. So technically a baroreceptor is sometimes classified as like a type of mechanoreceptor, but most mechanoreceptors, they kind of just function differently. This pressure that they respond to is when you have pressure from the inside pushing out, like blood that's pushing against blood vessel walls and stretching them outward and causing them to kind of, the smooth muscle there to contract to, not allow too much stretch to occur there. So those are baroreceptors. Where we have these baroreceptors in the carotid arteries and the aortic arches, or the aortic arch is only one in each body. We also have chemoreceptors there too. Okay, so location, as we stated before, exteroceptors respond to stimuli outside the body. So these receptors are very near the body's surface, like in the skin maybe, or very close to the external environment, like the first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve, and it actually has branches of it that are exposed to the lining of your nose. It's one of the few cranial nerves that's directly exposed to the external environment. Interoceptors respond to stimuli inside the body, like from organs and blood vessels, like those baroreceptors. And then proprioceptors monitor stretch from skeletal muscles and joint compression for body movement awareness. So proprioception, this awareness of which muscles are contracting, which ones are stretching, which joints are kind of being loaded gives your brain, an idea of where your body is or body parts are, like arms and legs, in space without necessarily having to see where they're located. You can close your eyes and you know that your arm is extended in front of you, something like that. Okay, nerve coverings. Bundles of axons are covered by connective tissues, just like muscles. Epineurium surrounds the entire nerve. Perineurium surrounds a fascicle. And endoneurium surrounds one axon or its fiber. Okay, so here, when you look at, especially at slides, maybe in lab, if you have a cluster of fascicles, the connective tissue that's capable of surrounding all of them, so it would have to be out in the periphery, is the epineurium. And then as you identify one fascicle, the connective tissue that can only, form a circle, a boundary around that fascicle is the perineurium. And the endoneuriums, they kind of, like when you look at them on a slide, they kind of look like macaronis on end, kind of like the ones up on the top there. Right? That's connective tissue that surrounds one cell or one fiber. So nerve types, we know we have sensory neurons carry impulses to the central nervous system. Motor nerves or motor neurons carry impulses away from the central nervous system. Sensory is also referred to as afferent, and motor is referred to as efferent. Okay, so of those nerves, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The cranial nerves, they may be more sensory, they could be, actually, I'll just say, they could be just sensory components in it or function, motor components, meaning it only carries impulses away from the brain. And some of them are mixed. They have a sensory component to them and a motor component to them. Spinal nerves have each. They have, exiting the spinal cord on the right and on the left. You will have a sensory neuron traveling toward the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, and the motor neuron exits the anterior aspect of the spinal cord. They both kind of join together as they pass through that intervertebral foramen, and then they can kind of bifurcate again. All right, so let's talk about the cranial nerves, because you need to know these, especially for nursing and things. So we had 12 pairs, and they were always identified with Roman numerals. And I will tell you this, there's ways to group this together, when it comes to memorizing them, if you're not familiar with them. And I'll just tell you, the first two are sensory only, like these two. The last two are motor only. And I will tell you this, is that some books will say there is a sensory kind of component to it called proprioceptive, but most books will consider it motor only, because it's virtually impossible to test that sensory component of proprioception. But technically, any muscles that are contracting, they can, again, back here, since you give proprioceptors can be, monitor stretching of skeletal muscles and joint compression. So technically, if these nerves compress or cause muscles to constrict or contract, then there is a proprioceptive component in it, but it's not one that you test. So for all intents and purposes, don't worry about it. So first two cranial nerves sensory only, last two motor only. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens are associated with eye movement. And when we get to special senses, you'll know exactly which muscles they provide the nerve supply for. I believe I've also, in another place captured it, but that's easier when you actually see the muscles. And then you go, okay, now I can put together which ones are innervated by oculomotor, which by trochlear, which by abducens. But oculomotor doesn't just provide the innervation to muscles that attach to the eye and move the eye. They innervate a muscle that elevates the eyelid called levator palpebrae. This muscle is a pupillary constriction. When we look at the eye, you'll see that you have two layers of muscle, and one layer squeezes down and constricts the pupil. The other pulls open the pupil for pupillary dilation. Oculomotor also innervates the muscles that act on the lens. So again, by the time we get to the eye anatomy, it will make a little more sense. But we have what's called the ciliary body, and that has muscles that act on the lens via these ligaments that attach to the lens of the eye. The trochlear nerve has one job, it innervates eye muscles, and actually it's one muscle called the superior oblique muscle. And then let me do 6 and I'll go back to 5. Cranial nerve 6 abducens on the bottom is also motor to eye muscles, and it's actually really just one muscle, lateral rectus. But for now, just know trochlea and abducens, is motor to eye muscles. Oculomotor, yes, to eye muscles, but not just the muscles that move the eyeball. They elevate the eyelid, they pupillary constrict, they act on the lens. Trigeminal nerve is cranial nerve 5. It's the largest cranial nerve. It has a sensory and motor component. Sensory, touch, pain, and temperature of the skin of the face. So the skin of the face. And the motor component are to the muscles of mastication, such as masseter and temporalis that you've already studied. Okay, then we go on to 7, facial nerve, and it also has a sensory and motor function. Vestibulocochlear has pretty much just sensory, and glossopharyngeal and vagus have sensory and motor as well. But before I move on to and discuss facial, I'm going to give you another grouping at the end of this, because facial shares some sensory function with glossopharyngeal and vagus, like taste. And so, and glosso and pharyngeal and vagus share not only taste together, but convey sensory information about blood pressure and blood gas levels from those baroreceptor areas. So there's going to be some overlap here, because once you get past the oral cavity, is that you have a lot of muscles there for speech and for swallowing, and different muscles help in different ways. They innervate different areas of the muscle for swallowing and speech. So there's going to be some overlap here, and that will be a good way to group these together. Like if you're going to make flashcards, I would group these together in these ways with flashcards. I'd have the first 2 cranial nerves are sensory only, and the last 2 are motor only. And I just want to go back a page and just, because I think as I was talking about, I somehow went right into the muscles for the eye. And I don't think I mentioned olfactory and optic. I said they were sensory only, but then I never actually said anything about them. So my bad, I'm sorry. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. These are sensory nerves, so they carry impulses to the brain regarding smell. Smell. Optic nerve is vision only. This is going to come from the retina. Smell comes from the linings of the nose. Okay, so back to my facial, glossopharyngeal, vagus kind of thing. Okay, so taste is one of those groupings. Facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. They're just going to innervate or have nerves to different regions. So taste for the facial nerve is the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, so the front of the tongue. Right? Anterior 2/3 of the tongue carries taste sensations. The motor component are muscles of facial expression. Right? Muscles of facial expression, like zygomaticus. All right. So don't confuse trigeminal with sensory to skin sensation of the face, and what facial nerve does, motor to muscles of facial expression, like zygomaticus. They also innervate the salivary and lacrimal glands, and thus it's going to have a big component, or a not big one, but it's going to make a contribution to the nerves that function in the autonomic nervous system, and part of the parasympathetic division regarding rest and digest. Well, salivary glands are associated with digestion, because you need saliva to leave the food and start carbohydrate digestion. We'll talk about that in AMP2. But it functions in the conveying of sensory information regarding taste. So that's all part of digestion. Okay, vestibulocochlear nerve is actually 2 totally different sensations: hearing and balance equilibrium. When we get to the special senses, and we look at the ear model, the inner ear, we have this snail shell looking structure that is where we have hearing receptors. And they are going to be a type of mechanoreceptor. Then we have 3 fluid-filled hoops with some sensors at the base of them, and they're associated with kind of balance and equilibrium and, velocity moving forward or backward in a vertical or rotational manner, like spinning around in a chair that rotates maybe, or speeding up and slowing down on the highway, you're already moving, or up and down in an elevator, that sensation of going up and down. Those 2 will be mechanoreceptors. So vestibulo-cochlear, hearing and balance. But we'll have more detail in special senses. Okay, moving on to glossopharyngeal and vagus. And I'll just say that these are the 2 most complicated, I would say, as far as functions to know. But they cover a lot of territory, in the oral cavity, areas of the oral cavity, and the pharynx. And then the vagus nerve is the only cranial nerve that innervates any of the structures, sensory or motor, below the shoulders, in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. Okay, so sensory, taste to the posterior third of the tongue. Sensations such as touch and temperature from the surface of the pharynx and the tongue, primarily to the back of the throat. I mean, to the tongue also. So, whenever you've had someone maybe doing a cranial nerve assessment and they're testing reflexes on you and say, okay, open your mouth and say ah and ah, and you're watching for the uvula, in the back of the throat, the little piece of tissue that hangs down from the roof of your tongue, or the back of the tongue hangs down. You're looking for that to elevate straight up and back. And that is a motor component of glossopharyngeal. But after that, they'll follow with, okay, open your mouth and you put a tongue depressor on the tongue. And then they might poke or kind of stroke the back of your thumb. So your stroke the back of your throat so that you kind of gag and cough. Well, it's part of what's called the gag reflex. And for you to feel that tongue depressor stroking the back of your throat is a sensory component, the surface of the pharynx, that's your oral pharynx, the throat. That is the function of glossopharyngeal. It conveys sensory for blood pressure and gas levels from the carotid arteries specifically, so right there in the neck, those are from those baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors found in those regions. And so they're going to be carried in glossopharyngeal. The motor component elevates the pharynx during swallowing and speech. It's called the stylopharyngeus muscle. And it's also motor to the parotid glands. So your parotid glands are those glands that are superficial to your masseter muscles. On a lot of the models where you looked at the masseter muscle, there was this funny looking gland, usually superficial on one side of the model to be able to see it. That's the parotid gland. All right. So that is glossopharyngeal. Taste, baroreceptor information, elevates the pharynx during swallowing and speech. Okay, vagus nerve, right, is the only one to extend past the shoulder. So that's a really good thing to remind yourself about vagus nerve, because if it's anything about sensation from, the abdominal pelvic cavity or the motor supply, it's going to be vagus nerve. All right, sensory component. Taste, just like 7 and 9, just like facial and glossopharyngeal, but this comes from the epiglottis. Remember, the epiglottis is composed of elastic cartilage that is down in the base of what's called the laryngopharynx, and it guards the entrance of food into the esophagus and air into your larynx. It also conveys somatic sensation from the epiglottis and pharynx. And so monitors blood pressure and gas levels from the aortic arch. So before we say glossopharyngeal, conveyed sensory for blood pressure and gas levels, but from the carotid arteries, which are in the neck. Vagus does the same thing, but this is going to come from a big vessel that's in your chest, in your thoracic cavity. So those 2 are baroreceptors and chemoreceptors there. They convey visceral sensations of organs in the thorax and the abdomen. All right, so we said whether it's sensation or motor from anything below the shoulders is going to be conveyed on vagus, baby. All right, it's motor to other muscles of swallowing in the pharynx associated with gagging. So before we said, or I said, that when you do the gag reflex, stroking the back of your throat, the ability to feel it is testing the sensory component of glossopharyngeal, but the gag, the motor response, you're testing vagus. It also functions in coughing, voice production, peristalsis, which is the coordinated propulsion of food through the esophagus all the way down to your rectum. And it slows down the heart. So when we stimulate and excite the vagus nerve, the heart actually slows down. Okay, then lastly, the last two cranial nerves, motor only. Accessory nerve is 11, motor to the nerve moving the shoulders and the head. Those specifically would be sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. All right, sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. And hypoglossal is motor to the tongue for tongue movement in such things as speech and swallowing. So most of it is going to be speech, but when you swallow, swallowing is a rather complicated activity because multiple areas are coordinated together. But part of swallowing is that your tongue has to push up against the roof of the mouth so that the food moves to the back of the throat. And that's what they mean by hypoglossal being associated with swallowing and speech. Okay, so this is a great picture that shows you the different cranial nerves. Some are kind of identified more on one side than the other, so you don't get too many black lines of labels all bundled up, right? But you can see that they're bilateral. Right? So here we have cranial nerve 1, olfactory nerve, optic nerve is cranial nerve 2. Here in the center midline, right and left, is oculomotor. And then just wrapping around the pons, because that kind of large area there with the fibers like going back and forth, it looks like the fibers are going right and left. That's the pons. So we have then trochlear 4, and this big trigeminal nerve. It looks like multiple roots, and it actually is, but it's the largest. Then you go back to midline for abducens, then facial nerve, vestibulocochlear. So they're going in order: 6, 7, 9, 10 is 9 is glossopharyngeal. 10 is vagus nerve. We have 11 accessory nerve that's made up of multiple roots here toward the midline. You can see those. And then hypoglossal 12, you kind of come back to midline, like you're making a circle from abducens, nerve 6 in a circle back to 12, and that's hypoglossal nerve. So not that you have to identify them on a picture in lecture, but you can see what sequence they are. This is good for lab. And then you start identifying their sensory or motor functions, or some of them even both. They have both sensory and motor. Okay, and this gives you detail more about vagus. Vagus is a huge nerve. Look at all to the right, all the different areas that it innervates. You can see right at the top, it's innervating muscles of the throat, so it's very active in swallowing, and what's called peristalsis. The heart, the lungs, the pancreas, the spleen. Sorry, the spleen, not the pancreas. I'm so used to putting them together. Kidneys to the bottom, or toward the bottom. The digestive organs, all those. Anything in the abdominal pelvic cavity, really. Motor and sensory is going to be conveyed on vagus. So you can read through some of these details a little bit more. Okay, spinal reflexes. Spinal reflexes are rapid, predictable motor responses to a stimulus. They are unlearned, unpremeditated, and involuntary. All right, so what this means is that we're going to be looking at things like, if you step on something sharp, how long does it take? Like, what is the pathway of, sensing this painful stimulus and what's the pathway for the sensory impulse to travel? What happens at the spinal cord level, and then how do we finally contract the muscles that we need to contract to pick your foot up so you stop stepping on something sharp. Okay, so we have a reflex arc that has 5 components to it: a receptor, sensory neuron, association neuron, or interneuron, motor neuron, and the effector. So the receptor triggers the action potential in response to a stimulus. Remember, receptors we looked at were different types: mechanoreceptors, pain receptors, thermoreceptors, photoreceptors, so forth and so on. So they're saying you're going to start with some kind of a receptor, right? Detects a change in the environment. The sensory neuron transmits the impulse to the central nervous system. Association neuron is the integration center, always found in the central nervous system. Their bodies, remember, are found in the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Then we had the motor neuron, whose bodies are found in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, carries the impulse away from the central nervous system and terminates on the effector and stimulates it to do something. Right? And that effector is either a muscle or a gland. It's got to do something, or it's got to be one or the other. So motor neurons will be stimulated by the association neuron. So we go from one to the other, to the other, to the other in this sequence: receptor, sensory neuron, association neuron, or sometimes referred to as an interneuron, motor neuron, and effector. Okay, so in this picture, and we have some models in most of the labs, I believe, that represent these 5 components. So number one, we start in the skin with some kind of a receptor. And if you see, this is a skin model, and they have, a nail actually going into the skin. All right, so that's the stimulus, something painful here, and a little bit of pressure, as well. All right, so we start with the receptor. It creates an action potential, because it responds to the stimulus on the sensory neuron in blue. Right now, that sensory neuron is action potential being carried on it. Here you can see its cell body here at the kind of on the top of the stick. We said this is the one that kind of looks like a hanger. Those cell bodies are located in the posterior root ganglion. Right? It enters the posterior gray horn, right? And when it splits like that and bifurcates, remember, it means that that's where it's going to have its synaptic vesicles and release its neurotransmitter. All right, it does so onto the interneuron or association neuron. See, different images use different terms. Their cell bodies are here in the posterior gray horn, where the sensory neuron is terminating. Now, the interneuron carries an impulse to the anterior gray horn, where we find the motor neuron in red. The round balls, of course, are the cell bodies. So motor neuron cell bodies are found in the anterior gray horns. Now, the motor neuron carries the impulse away from the spinal cord and terminates on the effector. And in this case, if it was skeletal muscle, the effector generally is going to be excitatory, but you can have, and you will have, 2 motor neurons going out. One is going to go to the one that should contract to maybe, remove your foot from a painful stimulus, which would be like your quadriceps muscles to bend your hip and your knee to lift up your foot. But at the same time, you're going to send a motor neuron to the opposing muscle group, the hamstrings, and not excite them, but inhibit them and make sure that they don't contract. All right, so that they don't contract. All right, so we have different types of reflexes. We have spinal reflexes or spinal somatic, I should say, and autonomic or spinal autonomic reflexes. Right? A spinal somatic reflex, the effector is skeletal muscle. So what are called stretch reflexes, tendon reflexes, flexor reflexes, crossed extensor reflexes, all those that are discussed in your textbook. Those are somatic reflexes because the effector is skeletal muscle. But we also have autonomic reflexes that's going to use that 2-neuron chain. And the effector would be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. And examples of that would be maybe a micturition reflex, which means that micturition means urinary. or to urinate. And pupillary reflexes, like when you flash a light in someone's eye, the pupils constrict. So there's two types. We have the somatic reflexes and the autonomic reflexes. So a stretch reflex, which is one of those somatics, we're going to look at that. All right, so we have two different ones we're going to look at. When a muscle is like overstretched and it's going to contract to help keep it from being impaired. Or we're going to have the opposite. We're going to have a tendon reflex, so what's called the Golgi tendon reflex. And that, is going to relax the primary muscle so we don't overcontract it. So they're going to be working essentially in opposition to each other. So in a stretch reflex, the receptor is what's called a muscle spindle, kind of looks like a slinky right in the middle, the muscle belly, the middle of the muscle. Over lengthening, which is stretching, of a muscle causes contraction as a response because you fear that it's going to be stretched too far. And so you stretch to a certain point, and then you contract back again. Antagonistic muscles on the same side, ipsilateral, are inhibited and remain relaxed. Reciprocal inhibition is when one action potential stimulates contraction in one muscle and inhibition in of its antagonist. So the point is if we want to lift our arm, let's say, we're going to more than likely contract biceps brachii. Then therefore we would want to inhibit triceps brachii because they work in opposition to one another. That's all. All right, so we stretch a particular muscle. Let's say it's the biceps brachii because you're tractioning on the tendon and you're using a reflex hammer. That causes a fast stretch, quick stretch in that biceps muscle, so that the impulses traveled on the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, to the association neuron, to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron back to the biceps brachii will be to relax it. I'm sorry, stimulate it, contract it, because because it's getting overly stretched. And to the opposition, like triceps brachii, you would inhibit that. Another example of that is the patellar reflex. And everybody's had these performed on them. Where you sit with your knees, at the edge of a table, and they tap on your, just below your kneecap, and you try to get their knee to, or their quadriceps to kick forward and kick the foot forward. And so you're stretching the quadriceps muscles, you're stimulating to contract the quads, but you're inhibiting the hamstrings. Okay. And this just shows you the loops there. All right, so you can look at those, shows you where the stretch reflex is coming from. They're essentially on the bottom showing you, hey, if I do that patellar reflex, and here's the reflex hammer at the patella, here's the patellar ligament right in the center of that diagram. All right, the muscle that's being tested is your quadriceps. So that sensory information goes to the spinal cord, along the sensory neuron in blue, association neuron out in the red. The red will stimulate that motor, the motor neuron. The effect on that quadriceps is to contract, so it has a plus on it. But it also has, look, back in the anterior gray horn, the purple or navy blue, I'm not sure what that is, motor neuron that goes to the hamstrings. And it has a negative next to it because we're going to inhibit the hamstrings so they don't oppose the quadriceps from doing their job. That's what they mean by that. All right, but we also have Golgi tendon reflexes. The Golgi tendon organ is a special receptor that responds to extraordinary tension or being stretched, but it's found in the tendons. Remember, the tendons are the ends. It's like the epimysium of the muscle. That continues as a tendon that attaches the muscle to two different bones. Well, if the receptors are found in those tendons, then they are stimulated. When the muscle, instead of being stretched, is now contracting, and now they're contracting so hard they're really pulling on those tendons at the ends of the muscle. So the stretch, and pulling on the tendons stimulates this organ to send signals. As a result, a stimulus is created to now, instead of stimulating and contracting that muscle further, we're going to inhibit it. We're going to relax the involved muscle, and the stimulus to the antagonistic side is going to be to contract this time. It's called reciprocal activation. Before is reciprocal inhibition. Now it's reciprocal activation. The result is the tendon causes the muscle to relax in response to muscle contraction. The opposing muscle group is going to be stimulated. The involved muscle is going to be relaxed. Stretch and tendon reflexes work against each other to keep muscles in tone and maintain posture. Okay, so here they're doing the same thing. We're looking at, the leg muscles, the quadriceps and the hamstrings. So the quadricep muscle strongly contracts and the tendons are activated. So let's say if you ever got a Charlie horse in your quadricep muscle, because that can happen. Now they're really pulling on the tendon organs. So again, it goes, the sensory neuron is the same, goes to the posterior gray horn. This is a good picture of the sensory neuron cell bodies located in the dorsal root ganglion. All right, we have two motor neurons leaving from the anterior gray horn. We have the red one that goes to the involved muscle, and you see the negative next to it. It says that the response, this is going to be a stimulus that inhibits that quadriceps muscle. So it relaxes because it's over contracting. And then the stimulus to the opposing muscle, hamstrings, look at the plus next to that in the anterior gray horn. So that means we're stimulating and contracting the hamstrings. Okay, so that is the last PowerPoint. There aren't a lot of these. I don't go through every single one. I think by the time you have down, which I would do, is define each component of a reflex arc. Right? Then when it gets to, just move back forward again. Oh, I'm going to, I beg your pardon. By the time we get to here, right, then you identify and you practice. One is the receptor. So, the skin, that's the receptor. Blue is a sensory neuron. The green here, at least, is the interneuron or association neuron. The effector in red, the motor neuron in red, and then the effector. And be able to essentially say, okay, the function of a receptor responds to a change in the environment. And, some instructors might ask you, say, and it creates an action potential in the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron in blue, maybe put arrows over that, giving you the direction the action potential is traveling. And then here's the cell body of the sensory neuron. That region would be the dorsal root ganglion. I might just write that next to that blue cell body found in dorsal root ganglion as a reminder, study tool. All right, enters in the posterior gray horn synapses with an association neuron or an interneuron. Right, then by the green ball there, I would write posterior gray horn because that's where their cell bodies are located. And then it transmits an action potential to the anterior gray horn where we find the red ball there of the motor neuron. That's its cell body found in the anterior gray horn. It conveys an action potential to the effector away from the spinal cord, and the effector, does something. It's either excited or inhibited. And it's going to be skeletal, some kind of muscle, I would say. In this case, it's skeletal muscle, but it's a muscle, maybe skeletal muscle, or it could be cardiac muscle or a gland. Just depends on whether it's a somatic reflex or an autonomic reflex. And that's why we're distinguishing here. Once you know those components, then I'm giving you one example, the stretch reflex, when the involved muscle you're testing is responding to being overstretched. So the response is to contract. And if the biceps, let's say, is contracting, then we're inhibiting the opposite muscles, right, like the triceps brachia. Or if we were stimulating and contracting, overstretching your quadriceps muscle, then we would be stimulating the quadriceps to contract and the hamstrings to relax and be inhibited. And then the opposite happens with the Golgi tendon reflex. Right? That means the muscle is contracting too much. Right? And now we want that muscle that we're testing to relax. So the same reflex arc, but the impulse to the muscle that we're testing here is going to be relaxed, and the opposing muscle group is going to be excited. So it's kind of helpful to look at these images. All right, that is the end.